All right, welcome back to College Football Addiction. Going to talk a little bit about this quarterfinal game between Boise State and Penn State. We've got Tom Hannifan back, State of the State podcast. And Tom, how was your Christmas, man? How you doing?
It was pretty good. I'm very grateful for my family and got some nice little gifts here and there. Got the noise canceling headphones.
Oh,
I'm
nice.
dying for because I just don't want to hear other people when I'm listening to podcasts and books and all that sort of stuff. So it's my favorite. I'm pretty happy right now.
Good
Happy
stuff.
holidays to you and your family.
Thank you very much. How does the excitement of that compare with the excitement of being in a quarterfinal right now?
And
And
it's
a pretty favorable one, if we could be honest.
It's very favorable, and I know a lot of Penn State fans, friends of mine, who went to the first round game in Happy Valley, and it was felt like 13 degrees with 35-mile-per-hour winds outdoors in central Pennsylvania. So for those that are making the trip to beautiful Phoenix, Arizona, to play a inferior opponent, at least on paper, it's pretty good time to be a Penn State football fan this time of year.
Do they still have feeling in extremities or
They're slowly getting it back. We're just kind of thawing them out. A lot of them went to Penn State
yeah.
Health, and they're figuring it out. They're not going to be the same, but they have smiles plastered on their faces. That's what's important.
Some things are worth it, and college football is one of those
Yes.
things. So. Let's talk a little bit about SMU before we move on fully into Boise State. I thought, as an outsider, I don't want the Penn State fans to light me up because obviously they completely dominated on the scoreboard and the game was never in doubt. But I did think that SMU moved the ball decently. They were obviously just atrocious at finishing and holding onto the ball, and you certainly can't take these things away. But I am going to play this game of outside of two pick sixes. And, if I told you if I told you that SMU had a first and goal from the 6, 5, and 2 and came away with 3 points, you'd think, wow, how in the world? So I do think Penn State's defense deserves a lot of credit for takeaways, bowing up in the red zone, things like that. But is there any concern coming out of that SMU was able to move the ball fairly well and Penn State needs to tighten some things up on that side?
I think there are always adjustments you can make coming out of those games. It felt pretty much coming out of that game that everybody was really happy with the defensive performance. And in the post-game presser, everybody was lauding defensive coordinator Tom Allen for the job that his defense did, coming away with 3 interceptions on Kevin Jennings. Quarterback Kevin Jennings for SMU was just never comfortable in that game. I thought it was an outstanding performance by Penn State's defense. The defensive line especially really had a field day, and I felt bad because it was absolutely a personnel mismatch in that the glaring deficiency for this SMU offense was along the offensive line, especially the tackle spots, and Penn State's defensive ends are elite. Abdul Carter and Dunai Dennis Sutton, Amin Vanover had their way with SMU's tackles throughout this game. So I think there's some things you can always clean up defensively no matter what. And I think the thing to remember is, yes, while this is technically the easiest path for any team to try and make it to the semifinal for Penn State, SMU, and then Boise State, these teams are in the playoff for a reason, as much as people want to debate that. They're still talented teams that are going to be able to put up points, that are going to be able to put up a fight. I have said it multiple times going into this playoff is that under the right circumstances, anybody can beat anybody within this field. And I feel that way about this Boise State game. If Penn State doesn't play their A game, I expect them to be very, very much dialed into it. But there's a lot of things you can look at with every team. You see those glaring superpowers. And SMU, their ability to move the ball offensively through the run and the pass and be explosive, that didn't necessarily go away, but it was certainly hampered. It was certainly slowed down. And I credit Penn State's defense with that.
Yeah. I want to talk about Boise State specifically, but something you just mentioned, everybody on the outside, and I understand like the coach speak of like, hey, well, just keep it internal, keep it here. But everyone on the outside thinks that this is the game that has the biggest chance of becoming what all the games last week were. People think Notre Dame, Georgia will be pretty close. People think Ohio State, Oregon could be the game of the playoffs. And then, think that maybe Arizona State can keep it closer than Boise State. Maybe that's a matchup that's a little closer. I don't know. I'm not super hopeful for either one of those matchups. But how does Penn State balance being not complacent, but just feeling like, hey, we got to win, and then also feeling the pressure of like, hey, we never know if we're going to get back here to this same spot and have kind of a favorable first two games, and like, how do you balance both of those?
I had a very good conversation with my co-host Justin King on State of State at one point in terms of talking about Penn State versus Oregon in the lead up to the Big Ten championship game. And I was talking to him about the knock on James Franklin and this Penn State football program about losing the big game, losing the top 10, top 15, top 5 teams. And unfortunately, that's been a recurring theme for James Franklin's tenure at Penn State. And Justin had an excellent point in that he said there's ghosts with Ohio State there aren't with Oregon. And that's such a natural thing within a program. If you get recruited by Penn State, what does everybody and their brother talk about? We've got to beat Michigan. We've got to beat Ohio State. And we just never quite get over the hump. And if you get recruited to Ohio State, well, what's been the narrative the last 4 years? Man, we have a lot of success, but we just can't get past Michigan. Even if you're a brand new kid and the slate is clean, you hear that. And even if it is the outside noise, you hear that. And I think Penn State, this existing program, has heard for a long time that they fail in the big games. And you can look at these things and say, well, SMU is an inferior opponent. Is it a big game? It's in the freaking college football playoff. Pretty darn big. Okay. Boise State looks like an inferior opponent. Okay. You're in the quarterfinals of the college football playoff. It's the Fiesta Bowl, a lot of eyeballs on New Year's Eve. I think Penn State, one step at a time, is attempting to prove people wrong. And whether that's James Franklin or the people on this team, they hear all of that stuff. And the program's really good, top to bottom, about exuding confidence and showing that, oh, we don't listen to that stuff. I think every program is lying through their teeth when they say things like that. They are absolutely hearing all of these things. And I think Penn State internalizes it in the right way.
So the matchup, maybe of the weekend, although there's a lot of good stuff, or of the midweek. I guess it's not really the weekend.
Yeah.
And everything else has me all messed up. But the matchup of the quarterfinal is probably Penn State's defensive line and the mixture of Ashton Jeanty and Boise State's offensive line, which I think a lot of people think Boise State is just Ashton. Their offensive line is really good. Now, we certainly will see when they play one of the best in the country, and this is certainly not the Mountain West anymore, but they've got a good offensive line too. Jeanty wouldn't have the numbers that he has without having some competent guys in front of him. And so, not to take anything away from him, just thoughts on that matchup. And obviously this, I think, is going to be the best defensive line they've seen all year. I know they played Oregon really early, but just thoughts on how that matches up, how they stack up. Do they try and stack the box? Do they trust their fronts without putting 7-8 guys in there? How do you think they play it?
I do think you see Penn State lean towards a heavier box in that respect, just early on, just to see how Boise State is going to play this thing. A lot of respect for what their offensive line has been able to do, but again, you do have to put it in the context of it's been mostly against Mountain West competition. I give credit to the game that they had against Oregon, granted very early in the season, and I would argue that Oregon team has evolved and gotten better. That defensive line has a lot of talent, but the skill of that Oregon defensive line is the pass rush predominantly. So to see them against Boise State was interesting. Penn State was able to run the ball on Oregon. Boise State was able to run the ball on Oregon. So you kind of have a little bit of a Venn diagram there. So whether or not this is the best defensive line that Boise State has seen this season remains to be seen. What I think the advantage is in this game is at the tackle spots. It's very similar to the SMU game. I worry about Boise State's tackles being able to hold up against Penn State's defensive ends. The thing that worked for Oregon running the football against Penn State was running the ball directly at Abdul Carter. Very similar strategy to the way that you've seen teams play the Dallas Cowboys, for instance. You know, no disrespect to the season they're having now, but when you're going at defensive end Micah Parsons, if you run the ball at him, you can kind of put him in a phone booth and you put him in traffic. That's been the best way to attempt to neutralize Abdul Carter. SMU could never get the running game going and just doesn't have that style of running game, period. So I think if Abdul Carter is able to be free and get to the quarterback when he can, that's going to be important. Penn State's defense ultimately has to keep Boise State behind the sticks because I feel Boise State will be committed to handing the ball to Ashton Jeanty 20 times minimum. Yeah. You just have to limit those gains. And as long as that isn't 4 yards a carry, you feel pretty good about that. The more often Penn State can put the ball in Maddox Madsen's hands, the better.
Yeah, it's almost pick your poison for Boise State. Penn State could certainly also play the game of we'll let you get your 150, but nobody else is doing anything. And it was
Hmm.
kind of like the way the way they would guard Kobe or LeBron or other guys, and you just hope he doesn't go for 250, right? Like
Right.
that's what you need. And or yeah, we're gonna shut you down and see if all the roll we'll double Kobe and see if all the other guys can beat us or not. And that's what I wonder. I wonder about that passing attack. Can they do enough? Can they have enough guys truly go off to keep it competitive, to keep it, or to have a chance to win, right? I don't mean any disrespect to Boise State, but they obviously are facing a pretty uphill battle here. And I'm not confident in their passing attack. I like Penn State's defense a lot, who was, again, when they're passing the ball, the secondary doesn't even, I don't want to say it doesn't matter to me, but I don't know. Does the secondary even matter when you got Abdul Carter rushing the passer
I
in
mean,
these days? I mean, that is it is so tough. I mean, Jennings was never comfortable, and he's got so much mobility, the most in the playoffs. I think he's got, and well, they're the most of the 12 teams that were in the playoffs.
sure.
And so I don't know that. That's what worries me. If they have to start passing the ball because the box is loaded, will they even have time to be able to do that? I'm sure the screen game will be good or a big for them if that's the route they go. But it feels like such a challenge for them to be able to move the ball consistently on that defense.
Well, as you well know, Penn State's defense and any defense, it's a symbiotic relationship between the secondary and that front seven, the defensive line. I think Penn State at their best is when they're able to just rush their front four, and you don't have success there unless you have security on the back end. And I don't think this is the greatest Penn State secondary ever fielded. The strength is for Penn State's safeties. There's real depth at safety that worries you as a quarterback. And there's just depth at corner. There's probably 6 or 7 guys that Penn State can rotate in there at defensive back, at corner specifically, that can just keep you guessing. Just that identification game. Where is this guy? What's the alignment here? Are they dropping into this coverage? Just making a quarterback think. So if you're putting Boise State in situations potentially where you can limit Ashton Jeanty and you're making Maddox Madsen drop back maybe once or twice in a 3-play drive, for instance, that's really the successful point for Penn State. And Penn State can get to you with the blitz no matter what. So I worry for Boise State's offensive line in this game. I think they'll be able to run the ball. And to your point, I think Steph Curry is going to get his numbers. You just hope to limit him. I think Ashton Jeanty is going to be able to do that. The thing that's his gift is he can make his own openings. He's that athletic in the backfield that he can find the smallest crease and make it into something. So Penn State's linebackers, the way that they played against SMU was outstanding. Obviously, they have to duplicate that performance.
I'll ask you this, then we'll go on. I didn't have this written down, but over under 140 rushing for Jeanty.
I'm going to say under.
Okay, I like it. I think that, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong here, but I also wonder about Penn State's offense, right? If we look at the other side of the ball, if Boise isn't having to chase, and if they're able to, SMU, I thought did a good job against Penn State's offense in the first half. I mean, if you take away, you can't take away pick sixes, but if you take away, I thought their defense played pretty well in the first half, and then things started to kind of snowball late in the half, and then in the second half too. But if Boise was able to find some success defensively, or Penn State just kind of struggled with some drops or missed passes by Aller or whatever, if they struggled a little bit offensively and Boise wasn't having to chase right away, it might allow them to be a little more patient with the rushing attack. All that said, this is an offense that can click and a running game that can click that, let's be honest, Boise hasn't seen since maybe playing Oregon. Thoughts on the way that Penn State's offense matches up here against the Boise State defense?
I think it's a fair point against SMU, 38-10 final score. 14 of those points came on 2 pick sixes from the defense for Penn State. So about 24 points. And it wasn't the greatest day for Drew Aller. I think he'd be the first person to admit that. He wasn't careless with the football by any means. I will factor in 13 degrees outside, 35 mile per hour winds. It's hard to throw the ball. It's hard to kick the ball. There's a lot of circumstances that played into that. So those are going to go away in Glendale, Arizona. So that's going to be helpful for Penn State. I think the defense for Boise State is very disciplined. They don't make a lot of mistakes. and they're very efficient when they blitz. I believe they're second in the country in sacks. Now, again, you look at that against the competition they face. Penn State's offensive line is going to have their work cut out for them, and I'm curious to see what Andy Kotelnicki does in terms of pass protection, in terms of those gadget plays to keep the defense guessing, because ultimately his goal is to lull you to sleep with the quote-unquote vanilla stuff and then throw something exotic at you that just makes you question your alignment, your assignments, those sorts of things. So I think it could be a really positive matchup for Andy Kotelnicki. Maybe the easier weather conditions could make this a good day for Drew Aller. This could also be a better day for Tyler Warren. Tyler Warren was relatively quiet by his standards against SMU. I credit that. Again, it's SMU focusing on him. Really good defensive line for SMU. I thought they caused some problems for Penn State's offensive line. However, Penn State controlled the offensive line, controlled the line of scrimmage, rather, for the bulk of that game and ran the ball extremely well. If they can be similar in this game, you have to duplicate that rushing performance that you got going against Oregon, the Big Ten title game. You showed it against SMU. Just keep committing to the run and everything else will come.
Yeah, Boise State struggles at times with missed tackles, one of the worst in the country, even against their competition, and wrapping up and tackling. And so that is something that concerns me for Boise State, because Penn State, Allard didn't have a great game. Again, weather, I kind of expect him to bounce back in this one if they need him to. If not, then I think they'll just keep pounding the heck out of the rock. But I think they'll run the ball with a lot of success. Obviously, they've got the two-headed monster in the backfield, but I do think that's somewhere that Boise State is going to have to get better in this game to keep it competitive. They've got to wrap up and tackle, and that is a lot easier said than done when you look at who Penn State's running backs are. But if they don't, the game could turn into a laugher. Like it could turn, and it may not be 38-10 again or 38-40. Like it might not be as widespread, because you're able to just kind of run the ball on both sides and bleed the clock and get out of there quickly. But I could see Boise State struggling to contain that rushing attack this weekend.
Yeah, I mean, what was the first round game that was 27-17? I'm blanking on who the opponents
Notre
were.
Dame.
Yeah. No, so on the scoreboard, that doesn't look too bad. But when you watch the game, you're like, ooh, Notre Dame controlled this from the opening kickoff. Penn State had a similar performance against Illinois at home earlier on this season. Final score was 21-7. But outside of the first couple of drives for Illinois, Penn State owned that game. So I could see a potential where this is a lower scoring game, and maybe if you just glance at the score, you're like, oh, Boise State hung in there. I could see it going a variety of different ways, but I do feel confident Penn State can win this game, and it's just taking this one thing at a time, because Ashton Jeanty is a legitimate threat at running back, and you just have to play smart with the football offensively. That's the thing about Penn State for the majority of this season, is that they're not putting up gargantuan offensive video game numbers. I think everybody wants to see Drew Aller all of a sudden be a 4,000 yard, 40 touchdown quarterback or something like that. He's just not gotten there yet. And I think he can. You could see that next season, all things considered. But he does what he has to do right now. He's very efficient with the football, and given the opportunity, he can slice and dice. He showed that against Oregon in the Big Ten championship game. So a lot of options for Penn State offensively.
I've seen the spread anywhere from 10, 10.5, 11, somewhere in there. I lean Penn State covering this. I just think that the path to Boise State keeping it pretty close is kind of narrow. Jeanty has to be Superman, which he's been all year, to be fair to him. And they probably need some Penn State mistakes, they were stopped a couple of times on 4th and 1. They need some stuff like that, some short fields to maybe keep this closer. Do you like Penn State to cover the spread? This is not a betting show, but do you think they kind of win going away?
I'm the worst gambler ever.
But take the opposite of whatever we say.
Exactly. Yeah, George Costanza, this whole thing. I like Penn State to cover. My question overall going into this game: if Ashton Jeanty is limited when you hand him the football, how do you get him the football in other ways? Because it's clear he's the first, second, and third option for Boise State. So if Penn State is able to take away the conventional rushing game and you have to get creative with getting him the football, are you still going to be able to move the ball? Are you still going to be able to move the chains? That's the big question for Boise State in this game.
Tom, where can people follow you? Where can they find your work, bud?
Check me out on Instagram and X at Tom Hannifan, TomHannifan. You can check me out on a variety of different podcasts, State of State, a Penn State football show with myself and Justin King, anywhere you get your podcasts, and the same with Believe in Big Ten, myself and the Big Ten Network and NFL Network's Rhett Lewis. You can check that out on SiriusXM, FanDuel Sports Network, and of course, anywhere you get your podcasts. So you can hear me yapping about college football in the Big Ten and otherwise in those platforms.
Awesome, man. I appreciate you, buddy. Have a good one.
Thank you so much. Happy holidays.